Well, in the latest round of violence, thousands of Congolese refugees have fled the country. That's according to the UN Refugee Agency. Many of them are fleeing to Uganda over Lake Albert, which is a dangerous crossing. CGTN's Michael Baleke has that story.
The UN Refugee Agency says more than 4,000 people have crossed into Uganda in the last 7 days. And there are fears that thousands more could arrive if the security situation inside the Democratic Republic of Congo does not improve. Many are fleeing ethnic fighting between the Hema and Lendu communities from the provinces of Ituri and North Kivu in the eastern DR Congo bordering Uganda. The main crossing into Uganda, according to the UN Refugee Agency, is via Lake Albert. Refugees are said to be using rickety and unsafe boats, a journey that has already cost the lives of several people. The situation has been more dangerous in recent days because of bad weather. Many others continue to arrive in Uganda on foot in the southwestern districts of Kisoro and Toroko. Humanitarian agencies say several of the new arrivals are in deep trauma from the violence. Many are exhausted, hungry and sick. The influx in Uganda has already led to a cholera outbreak that has already killed at least 32 people since February. The Refugees Response Funding appeal for Uganda of nearly $180 million remains poorly funded. This is restricting capacities of humanitarian organizations to deliver vital aid and assistance for food, water, shelter, and health care. Michael Baleke, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
Well, worrying developments there in the DRC. Let's get you more on that. I'm joined live in the studio by Richard Moncrief. He's the Central Africa Director at the International Crisis Group. Thank you very much for coming in, Richard. A damning report there, as we just heard from the UN, on the actions of Congolese troops. What's being done to investigate these killings and the excessive use of force?
Well, there's the UN investigation, but there's also a domestic investigation. In fact, there was a mixed commission of inquiry headed by the Human Rights Minister, but with civil society involved, and they just reported. And their report was fairly frank. I mean, coming from a minister and endorsed by the government, it was fairly frank on the number of deaths that have been in protests, mainly in Kinshasa, and recommended actually some quite sensible measures. So even some in government see that shooting at protesters is a very bad idea in these very tense times in the country.
And well, the UN peacekeeping mission is facing a tough task, as we know, when dealing with this ongoing crisis. How well would you say is the mission being supported?
Well, not very well. They are mainly based in the North Kivu province of the east of the country. There's a lot of violence there, but we've just seen on your report people moving over Lake Albert. That's in Ituri province. It's in the east, but it's still miles away from the main UN base in Goma. So that just gives an idea. So
they're not spread in the right areas?
They're not always in the right areas, but there's also a huge challenge because the country is enormous and there are pockets of instability cropping up quite unexpectedly, both in the east, also in the Kasais, which is more to the south. And then, of course, there's Kinshasa, where as we approach elections towards the end of the year, we can expect things to heat up there as well. So the UN is facing a difficult task in a very large country. Is it well supported? Well, it's often short of equipment. Troop mobility remains a very big issue, and relations with the government are not easy either.
What about funds? Is there donor fatigue, would you say?
Well, the actual MONUSCO force is funded by assessed contributions from the UN, so that's not quite the same as donor fatigue. There is something. Donor fatigue does exist on DRC. I think the problems there have been going on for so long that there are a number of donors in the humanitarian field who are not giving what they might, and you might talk about donor fatigue. But the actual UN force is funded by assessed contributions. So funding isn't so much a problem. Equipment can be, but that's not quite the same as funding.
You mentioned the refugees going to Uganda over Lake Albert. Millions of people displaced overall, and more, you know, fleeing violence every day. How much strain would you say that's putting on the region as a whole?
A huge amount of strain. Uganda is one of the biggest recipients of refugees per capita in the world and is under huge strain. There's been violence in Ituri province, that's very recent, just in the last couple of months, and people are fleeing across the lake, as we just saw. That adds to previous violence throughout the whole of last year in the Kasai region to the south, which caused thousands of people to move into Angola to seek refuge. And of course, as you mentioned, this is about the region, around 750,000 refugees, Congolese refugees in their neighbours, but we've also got 4.5 million people displaced by violence in the country. So yes, the stress is both on Congo and on the regional, the neighbours are very great. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your update on the difficult and very awful situation going on there in the DRC. That was Richard Moncrief there. He's the Central Africa Director at the International Crisis Group. Thank you very much for coming in.